food pantry farm there. And I'd always been doing landscapes and portraits and paintings. And while I was living in this community, a priest that was a part of the community, Father Tom, said, "Have you ever tried painting an icon?" And I hadn't. And so I got really curious. And I started doing what all iconographers do, is you're tracing the lines. And you can kind of see these two pieces in the back, which are these pretty lovely older icons, traditional icons. And so iconographers would take the piece like that and start tracing the lines. So I did that for a long time, tracing the lines and continuing to kind of scenes of Jesus and the saints and Mary. But after a while, I was kind of putting the puzzle pieces together, and I was thinking about something that my best friend Paul said as we were farming and growing food for the food insecure, thinking about as Jesus' words of consider the lilies of the field. What does it mean for us to consider the lilies of the field and having a right relationship with the earth? So that became the focus of my first icon. Now, it's called Christ Considered the Lilies. Now, it's a good first try. The lines are a little shaky, and one of our Franciscan friar friends says it actually almost looks like Jesus is surprised that the lilies are in his hand a little bit. But what it did is what I was talking about yesterday, and what was really meaningful is that the community I was involved with embraced it. Even though it wasn't a great first icon, it still was meaningful because they embraced it, and it really showed me that art can potentially do, which is it can be a placeholder for a community's thought, prayer, but most importantly, their action and how they want to live. And the fact that they took that and put it up at the wall in our prayer space meant a lot to me. And so I think that's through that experience, and I think that's why I've continued to now do this for over 15 years. But just a few terms. So icon is literally just Greek for image, okay? And then iconographer literally means icon writer, right? And so within the tradition, writer really, you might have heard, you paint an icon, you write an icon. I think for me, it's interchangeable. For the first kind of iconographers, there was this idea that you were actually writing scripture. So to deviate from the forms from before was like you were kind of going off script from the Bible, per se. But, whether some people don't really hold that same theology, but as it's continued, this is a really famous early icon of, supposedly the first iconographer was St. Luke. St. Luke sat with Mary in her old age, and she told him stories about her attending Jesus as he grew up, and so this is him painting Mary during that. But just as for the East, really embraced iconography, the West was more so kind of focused on stained glass and other things. Like originally, I think why it existed is that, for much of the time in the early church, a lot of people were illiterate. They couldn't read, they couldn't write. And so really the art in our churches was kind of sometimes the only way that people knew what was going on in the service. I mean, there's this famous thing with in the Latin during the Eucharist that people didn't know what was being said. And so they just heard the priest kind of doing all this stuff, which the term hocus pocus comes from. Them not like it's this hocus pocus, they didn't really know what was going on, but look at these lovely stained glass windows, But I want to begin, this came up yesterday in our conversation with the piano, and I want to focus on the artwork that I grew up with in church. And I grew up in a small Protestant denomination near Chicago, and we only had 2 pieces of artwork in the entire church. It was a rather big church, but they were both painted by the same man. This is Warner Solomon. And you might recognize this piece. There it is on the right. And it ended up being called the Protestant icon, or the head of Christ. Almost Jesus in like a 70s yearbook, kind of like side photo thing going on. Right. And then it was this one, which was in our narthex, and then the painting on the left, Christ knocking on the door, which was very strangely above the changing table in the nursery. But what's interesting about this image, that these were the only images that I grew up with, is that unfortunately in America, we were talking about this yesterday, we've kind of locked Jesus into one image. He's a white, blonde, blue-eyed, haired man. So if Jesus is white and God is white, then potentially authority is white, and so on. It's in the church, this has kind of been a huge conversation as Evie and I have been going across communities with different denominations and having conversations. It's really been about representation and diversity in our images and how we relate to one another, how our imaginations, we kind of go out into the world and the work that we're doing. Again, this is, hi Lindsay, this is St. Luke Salisbury that Lindsay mentioned. This is the area where the pieces are, the Transfiguration and the Pentecost there in the back of the sanctuary. If you all are able to go, we're obviously very happy that those images are there. But that's what I kind of wanted to begin. I think some of our initial work was really diving into this idea of representation and how we look at the person of Jesus within that, and kind of taking a deep dive into the images that have come from before, but in the context of community and these conversations and the people that the church actually is made up of, how can we kind of reimagine things? So this was an early one that is, you've seen, this is the Good Shepherd. A lot of this paint was painted for the Good Shepherd Episcopal Church in Athens, Ohio. It's a community kind of surrounded by farms and different farming communities. And we really were looking towards the kind of the shepherds of the time in the Middle East. It was really beautiful through all of our research that shepherds in Jesus' day would actually spend sometimes up to 3 weeks out with their flocks in the desert. And the only way that they could potentially even get like water or food was to drink the milk of the ewes in the flock. So it was really kind of showed us a story of a Jesus who was more so needed us just as much as we needed him. This kind of idea with us. You know, this famous Psalm 23 that we said, the Good Shepherd Psalm. If you look at the Hebrew words, if you start from the beginning and count the words to the middle, and then from the end and count the words to the middle, the very central word in the Hebrew is with. This is a God who's with us and there with us in our humanity, and showing him as a man, a Middle Eastern man of color, was really important for that congregation as they reimagined their work in that community. But also a diversity in terms of showing the Good Shepherdess, the shepherd as a woman. This was commissioned by a woman, Episcopal priest, and her daughter became an Episcopal priest, and this was her gift, ordination gift to her. But their family was from Shetland, Scotland, and in Shetland, Scotland, on the island, there was, just through the culture and their tribe, over the centuries, it was really women that took the role of being the shepherds in the community. And so how that kind of informed her and her daughter kind of moving forward in her ministry. The icon on the left is probably one of the most famous icons. It's by Andrei Rublev. It was painted, kind of debated around between end of the 1400s to 1500s, but it's called the Trinity. It depicts the Rublev was looking for symbols and metaphors, and that's what a lot of icons are trying to do. They're trying to take symbols and metaphors and meaning and kind of put them together in such a proper way where they become beautiful. And that's what one of the interpretations of art, the word art in the Latin, is where two things come together in such a proper way where they're beautiful, right? But the metaphor he found that was helpful was the story in Abraham of Abraham and Sarah entertaining the three angels in this kind of grouping. Whereas the piece on the right was commissioned by Father Mark Rizzuti Jones from New York. He wanted to kind of reimagine that and playing with the metaphors. Instead of having three angels, it was men, but it's having three women and three women of color. And instead of even though they're together here, they're holding hands. Instead of the wine, there's grape and wheat to kind of symbolize the work that we all have, that still has to be done. One angel has the Holy Spirit, which is in green. It's holding her hand out left, supposedly pointing towards the viewer. And if you notice, the temple in the background is supposed to symbolize God, the temple of God, the tree of life, but also the cross, and then the mountain, the wilderness, the Holy Spirit, the being out in the desert. So really just kind of expanding upon those metaphors in a new way. Again, as we talked about a little bit yesterday, this was Transfiguration, but the Transfiguration that we did for St. Luke's. And for those that didn't hear, they went on this long journey about representation in their artwork and their spaces. Ken and Lindsay talked about yesterday. But one of those conversations was this idea of someone wanting the robes of Jesus to be very white. And another member of the congregation was very uncomfortable with that. She said, I don't like the term whiteness. Could we think of something else? And through our conversation, we said, what if it was more about the brightness? And then that led us to how we could translate that through paint or some material, and we settled on silver leaf. So it was a mirror. So it was mirroring us, but it also, as we look at it, was also reflecting out in a way. And it says, I didn't think this piece ended up being a gift. It's not something that you're supposed to do in iconography, and specifically this image, but I think it became a new gift to us, and I think hopefully to Salisbury too, as they try to continue to look at themselves and their community. So here's an interesting one. These are some icons of Christ Emmanuel, and they're older. And can anyone notice anything about these? Yeah, but they're not big noggins. Yeah. So this is just so Christ Emmanuel, the metaphor that the early iconographers came up with to show kind of the great knowledge of Jesus at that time was just to give him a big head. Which makes sense. That's what they had. That's how they thought they could interpret it. But I thought it was a little strange. But so I was trying to get at what is the kind of the knowledge that Christ. I mean, the Gospel of John this morning, that Christ's love was kind of really the thing that set him apart, his knowledge of what that meant. And so I began to kind of reflect on that. So I thought about the experiences that I had in Palestine in 2008. I got to be a part and live with a small farming community there in the West Bank in Hebron. And these kids at this village organized nonviolent marches in their community. One of their roads to their school, which was 4 miles to their school that they walked every day, got cut off from extremist Zionists, and they had to take this road that was 11 miles to and from school, which is awful. And they organized a nonviolent march, and it was like, we're going to reopen our little 4-mile road. And they did. It was a group of 100 kids and their moms. It was absolutely beautiful march. And so I wanted to kind of show that version of a young Jesus who, some of these kids that I met, just their faces full of love and joy, even though experiencing so much pain, unfortunately during this time, probably are now as well. But they just showed the hope and resilience and joy of youth. But the knowledge that brings is also a beauty and something I think God with us, Christ Emmanuel, that Jesus must have had within his gaze and in his youth. This was a really fun one. So this is the parable of the mustard seed, and the more traditional older icon on the left we had seen, and it's like one little bush with a few birds that all look alike in it, and I was like, oh, how can we reimagine that? So we were looking at different images, and the parable of the mustard seed, is a face like the mustard seed, but looking at the verse, Matthew, that the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. It's planted in a field, though it is the wildest of all shrubs. It's wildest of all shrubs, the birds of the air come and roost in its branches. Sorry, I kind of butchered that, but really what's interesting is in looking at it and through some of the exegesis of it, I mean, in the Jewish Mishnah, in the law, the the people hearing this parable from Jesus would have been absolutely perplexed by it, because in the Jewish law, you weren't supposed, it was forbidden to plant mustard seeds in your garden or plant them at all. And the birds of the air really represented the foreigner in a lot of the Hebrew poetry and songs, like the foreigner, the other. So that Jesus is calling the kingdom of heaven this thing that is, more about the welcoming the stranger, and those who you don't think belong actually do. And I think with that, for a lot of even other Christians, this kind of kingdom will look like weeds, but it actually could be the very type of church and type of kingdom that Jesus is actually calling us to. This is St. Joseph with baby Jesus. When I got this commission, it was from a family, and they said, do whatever you want. We just want Joseph with baby Jesus. And Evie, when we got this commission, she says, let's do it, but whatever you do, you have to make baby Jesus absolutely adorable and cute. And I was like, you're absolutely right, because art history hasn't really given us a lot of good examples. So, I don't even know what's going on in the middle. But I knew that we did our job when we went to Connecticut to give a presentation of the work, and I don't think he knew he was being watched, but Bishop Mello, who's the Bishop of Connecticut, he came up to the icon, and we just saw him from behind going, But no, I think it is also about this thing that we've talked a lot about through this work. In a lot of icons, you'll notice that there is this kind of stoic, kind of straight face. And a part of the theology at the time was really about that by putting any emotion into the face is going to distract the viewer from the divinity, or distract the viewer from the saintliness, or distract the viewer from this. But I just don't think as humans that that's something that we attach to. I don't think it's approachable. And so for us, I think we've really tried to approach the work in a way where we're trying to bring some emotion into it, not to kind of to draw the viewer in, and to draw us into the personhood of Jesus and the personhood of God, God with us again in a new way. I'll skip over those guys again. And so in that similar vein, prodigal son, and a lot of the images that we've seen is, like on the left, I showed my mother this image. We were telling her that we were going to do a new version of it, and I showed her the image on the left. And she goes, oh, the dad doesn't look happy to see him at all. And she was right. And so we really wanted to interpret that. Obviously, the father and son as Middle Eastern men, but again, just the son kind of relieved almost face, and the father obviously joyful tears, and in the other image they're kind of like seventh grade dance kind of a thing. So we wanted something that's more of an embrace. And if you see the image too, I always love the aspect of, in some of the older icons, you'll see the older brother who's kind of pissed off, that is, younger brothers come home, so having him in the doorway, just standing there if you can see him. And then the little pigs following the younger brother to his father. Just trying to bring, again, some of those symbols and kind of reimagine. This is a super fun one. I grew up near Chicago, Aurora, but this piece in the center is called the Madonna Scroll. And it's at the Field Museum there in Chicago, and it's painted on silk. And it's painted in China around the 17th century, they think, but they don't know who the artist is. But what really perplexed them is that it was obvious to some of the art historians that it was somehow this artist, the Chinese artist, saw this image of the Salus Populi Romani, which was painted all the way in the 4th century. And Pope Francis has a big devotion to this icon, which is in Rome. But they saw that, and they painted it, but they reinterpreted the image as Mary and Jesus as Chinese. I thought that was really lovely, this kind of idea of reimagining, but also trying to relate oneself to Christ, but also in that, then other people who now see it can kind of re-narrate that and kind of understand the diversity of God with us in all of humanity, right? And so I tried, as best I could, wanted to then basically paint an icon of an icon of an icon and reinterpreting this piece instead, the baby Jesus holding Mary's hand and trying to make the background almost look like the silk from the other piece. We talked a little bit yesterday, but saints, so not only going back and talking representation and diversity in our images that have come from before, but also in the way that we look at the saints. And talked a little bit about this, but from what I can understand, for the first 1,000 years of the church, saints were chosen by the local people. It was people that you knew, that you lived with, who were in your community. Then after, I'm paraphrasing this very quickly like I did yesterday, but then after 1,000 years, the Pope said, actually, that's my job. And so what happened, though, it stopped being people that you knew. And it stopped being people that you knew. There were saints from Italy and other places, but who lived obviously saintly lives. But so really, we kind of explored this, been really thinking about saints here and now, and thinking about that as local communities and communities. As we've traveled around, hearing from the people that have really affected these communities, and that there truly are saints, though they haven't had all of these miracles, that need to be attributed to them. The Catholic Church, you have to have, 2-something miracles attributed to you before you can even be considered. And I think we've talked a lot about, well, it's a miracle. I think it's a miracle that, John Lewis walked over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, in 1965 with many others, got beat over the head, almost killed, but still came back the next day. That's a miracle. Or St. Francis, in his time, seeing a leper, the most despised people, a person on the margins, and having so much compassion on him that he was overcome and had this deep conversion of love and care for a fellow human on the margins. That's a miracle. So I think really it's diving into not solely the totality of someone's life, but again, as an icon, you're looking at it and it's looking back at you. It's calling us towards something new. It's calling us to, with John Lewis, with others in this, and there's so many others that should be in this icon. Javier was noting that he likes that Frank Orange and the other Adrian Young are kind of off to the side. It's like there's more people kind of added to it. But that there's many others that we can look to that can really inspire us to then go out and do the same, as it said. And that's our hope. So really trying to then look at that and new ways to even interpret the saints. This is my most recent icon that we did. So Mary Magdalene, and it's called Mary Magdalene Christ the Gardener. And a lot of the images, it kind of shows a Jesus kind of warding over Mary as on the resurrection morning. But we were thinking about it and talking with some other friends, and it's interesting that I don't think it's an accident that in John's gospel Mary mistakes Jesus for the gardener. I don't think it's a mistake. It's I think John was the writers of John were trying to tell us something about the personhood of Jesus. So having Jesus kind of, again, loving where it hurts in the dirt, for real, on the ground, tending these plants, and Mary kind of standing tall, looking for Jesus, finds him. She finds Jesus is kind of there in the dirt, in the humus of humanity, humus soil, there with us. And that's where she finds him and recognizes that kind of Jesus. And we tried to snuck in all kinds of little symbols. You see the tomb there with the shrouds, clothes empty. There's some little eggs in a tree there, 3 eggs, and the little plants that he's taking care of. But again, trying to understand some of these stories and bring some new perspectives to it, who these people were. Mary Magdalene is often disregarded, and for a long time there's been all this beautiful theology and writing, over the last few decades about, she really was the apostle to the apostles, and who she was. You might have seen this one. We've gotten really close, Evie and I, with the Franciscan friars. During the pandemic, we were able to drive across the country and live with the Franciscan friars in California for 2 months. And it was an absolute delight. And Brother Jeff McNabb had commissioned several pieces from us. This is a story that there's been a lot of Franciscan lore. St. Francis preaches to the birds, but a lot of the Franciscans, one of the Franciscan historians we met said it was probably the other way around. It was more of St. Francis being present. And so we wanted to reinterpret it as a bird preaching to St. Francis. And I'm very much a bird watcher. I like birds, so I was kind of into that idea anyway. But yeah, just kind of embracing being present, someone being present to the world around them in a way. And of course, St. Francis continues to be an inspiration as we think about climate change, but also care for those people affected by all the climate change. And the poorest of the poor are now the people that are the most affected by what's going on now in our time. And this is really a way to reflect on that. You'll notice there was an image of Dorothy Day in the sanctuary, which was this one, the Dorothy Day Holy Family of the Streets. But the first piece that we did was we actually called it Dorothy Day, Don't Call Me a Saint, based off of the quote that Javier shared. Emmy and I, again, we like to talk about that. What we think she was saying was, don't call me a saint, I don't want to be dismissed so easily, because this is work that we can all do. Like, we all have this capacity to care for the poor, the orphan, the widow, and the stranger in our own time. And by putting a halo on me, I don't want to distance myself, that people don't think that they can do this, they can. And so we decided not to put a halo on her for that reason. But after talking and getting to know a few people that knew Dorothy Day personally, we decided to put a halo in this image as a way of like, no, like this, even though she said this, and she is being considered for canonization in the Catholic Church, it was a way for us to kind of show that like this work in the ordinary, every day, on the ground, being with people is a holy act that we all can do. And it is sacred, and that the sacredness is within all of us. So having everyone have the halo in this image was important to us. This holy family on the streets, refugees or unhoused people that she's welcoming in to her home. This is Martha P. Johnson. She was obviously involved with the Stonewall riots, but hearing more about her life through some different new kind of books and histories that have done her, she again, the language wasn't there in her time, but was be considered trans, or she can self-identified drag queen, but she had a strong devotion to Mary and to Jesus, and was known to be praying for her fellow trans brothers and sisters on the streets in front of a statue on Christopher Street. She would spend hours there praying for these different individuals, and she was very much known as a protectress of those on the streets and their lives, and taking care of all these people, as even though herself was experiencing a lot of pain. And unfortunately, it is trans women of color that are some of the most, are experiencing the most violence in our time due to so many different things. And so that it was someone who is the most vulnerable, who is taking care of the most vulnerable people. And I think that's someone who we ought to look to as we take care of the most vulnerable people in our own communities and in our time. A few more saints. I love Saint Dulce of the Poor. She lived in Brazil, São Paulo, and she was a nun, and they took care of the homeless poor there. But what I loved about her is that it said that she used to take her accordion out and play songs and busk to make whatever money she could for the poor. And I love this kind of idea of using her art and her music, and even if it was a few coins, which apparently it usually was, that she was kind of using that beauty and the art to still take care of her fellow man. And then Thomas Merton, this person very much connected to his work. I'm a little bit of a hermit sometimes, but he really was someone who was a hermit, lived in Gethsemane Monastery in Kentucky, beautiful writer and poet. And for those of you who read the Seven Story Mountain, just a beautiful autobiography, but he was someone who was the hermit that was being called out to the world. And I love the aspect that he kind of, as he continued to, in his spirituality, was being called back into the world. Having secluded himself, he was called back into the world. And he's someone who's continuing to inspire now after he passed to kind of continue to go out, even as we have time to rest. It's this like calling out of us that his story really inspires us in that way. So again, we have all these metaphors and symbols from the past, but what about the here and now? I'm a little bit running out of time, but we have this. We'll just go a few more. Mary left for being born. This idea of the universe continually growing within us, and this idea of Mary being pregnant with Jesus, that the universe was within that, and it stemmed from a poem that Brother Jeff, the Franciscan friar McNabb, shared before he passed, the day before he passed, and I was inspired by that. This was a kind of happy accident. This was an icon I did in the Transfiguration, one of the first ones. And my nephew Elliot and I were messing on our iPad, and I don't know what he did, but he accidentally did that. And so we ended up calling it glitch transfiguration. This idea of that the transfiguration, like we often try to make our own transfigurations, but the thing, and like Peter, we're like trying to make our own booths. But the thing is, the light, what Peter failed to see is that the light that we think that we hold has already been scattering and reflecting all around. Like, we can't contain the wildness. That's why Jesus is asking us to follow into Jerusalem, but we don't want to do it. Like, the light is going to places that we're not necessarily going to expect. And so I was like, well, that proves that. This is the original woodcut by Otto Hancock. We've often kind of gone back to more modern pieces of art to kind of inspire the work. Which directly inspired the Christ bricks, the rifle. Again, Otto Hancock was considered a degenerate artist by Hitler during his time, and you can see why in his nonviolent content. But again, in our time, guns continue to be a thing that are affecting the most vulnerable people in our society, oftentimes children. And so kind of bringing that into a modern context with an AR-15 seemed appropriate. So again, the least abuse has been a huge part of a lot of our work. I'm going to skip ahead, actually. And one of the most important icons, I think, that happened to us was this piece called Mama. Evie and I painted this in 2020 after the tragic death of George Floyd. Living in St. Louis during that time, St. Louis, and that experience, not only Evie and I were absolutely gutted by, like so many others, the death of George Floyd, but the community of St. Louis with the Ferguson riots still being fresh in their mind, was deeply heartbroken. And so Evie and I thought, like, what can we do? What's an image that we could potentially create that where we could kind of draw attention to the sacredness of Black life? And we immediately thought of, in the life of George Floyd, but Evie immediately thought of the Pietà, and quickly we started to kind of wrestle with this, that mothers are continually losing their sons and their daughters who are unjustly murdered by the state, just as Mary did 2,000 years ago. And originally we had seen this photo. This is George Floyd in his mother's arms when he's 3 years old, on there on the left. And it just, again, it confirmed that idea of the Pietà, that this mother holding her son, not only in infancy and young age, almost like a Madonna child, but then in his death. And the fact that George Floyd, the last thing he said when he passed was, "Mama," just absolutely broke us. And originally, when the creation of this, and the sketch right on the board, on the top left, you can see the eyes of the Mary were looking at the dead figure. But then Evie suggested, and right, so what if we had the eyes looking at the viewer instead? As almost as to say, what are we going to do so this doesn't keep happening? And I think what happened is that this image was, we had a lot of conversations in our community in St. Louis about, is this image appropriate, is this right? a lot of conversations happening in the Black community, and still are, of if it is appropriate to show the dead black body, and they're valid. But we have many Black friends and clergy tell us, no, this image is needed in this time. And it was unfortunately also very much resisted. Got a lot of different threats. There's where this eventually went was Holy Communion Episcopal Church in St. Louis, and another Catholic church threatened to come in and break in and take it down and burn it, and terrible things. It was very resisted. We got a lot of mail, though, during this time, and emails and letters of people asking, okay, is this George Floyd or is this Jesus? And that question kind of hit us. And the answer, I think the most faithful answer that we could come up with in that moment was yes. And that bugged a lot of people, but I think what it was that they were trying to, this kind of dualistic either or question was fine for the sake of conversation, but not for the truth. It is Christ, but as St. Teresa of Calcutta said, it's also Christ in distressing disguise. Jesus says he's to be found in the least of these and those who suffer, as George Floyd did, so it's therefore also George Floyd. Right? But what this image has really done, and I think what all art can potentially do, is it created a dialogue. A lot of it was online, but a lot of it was also in person. And I think that dialogue is something that also the art in our churches can do. And I hope that the pieces that Evie and I have been able to share with your community, the pieces that we've worked on over the last several years, can create that dialogue. That this has a way to kind of potentially see one another in new ways. And as you talk about a piece and see a piece, like, why, in this piece you'll notice, might notice certain things that you hadn't seen before. We're really out of time. We'll keep going. But in the same way, that's what happened. We had the opportunity to paint Matthew Shepard for the National Cathedral, which was a complete honor. But again, there's the whole practice of, in doing this piece, they wanted to make Matthew Shepard into an icon and have a halo, but Matthew's parents, Judy and Dennis, were uncomfortable with that. They said, our son isn't a saint, he's snuck out of the house all the time. So we continued. But what we really did is we came up through our conversations, we had found out about all these letters that were continually being left at the cathedral, and Judy and Dennis received from people across the country about their son Matt. And we said, what if that became the gold leaf? What if that became the gold kind of surrounding Matt? And once we did that, it made complete sense. And there's a lot to say about this piece, but when we put that on there, we finally unveiled the piece, it was absolutely beautiful to see people come up and read all of these letters. So Evie and I spent meticulously kind of cutting out copies of these letters from real people. I pray for you, this could have been me. Just much love, I pray for you. Just all these beautiful things, and seeing people get up close and look at them and talk about that, and how that many of these people being LGBTQAI individuals, I could tell that conversation was happening, that dialogue, that, what are we going to do again so this doesn't happen again? What happened to Matthew and his murder? And so lastly, I just, we are inundated with images in our time. They're absolutely everywhere in advertisements, billboards, social media. And so I think another thing we can do is church art in our time can really teach us to observe. And this is the piece for those who were there yesterday. I painted this icon called Christ the Pantocrator, and it was just the face of Christ. And I was really frustrated with it, and it's Christ the teacher, he's holding a gospel book. Well, unfortunately, I kept painting his hands really tiny, so I ended up calling it Baby Hands Jesus. And so I put it on I just got so frustrated with it, put it on a shelf. Well, a few years went by, I got some new gold leaf, and I wanted to try it out. So I was like, oh, I didn't like this, so I took it down, and I put it down. I hastily covered the board with gold leaf. But when I did that, what I noticed is that you could still see the raised face of Jesus in it. Even though it looked like a gold leaf board from far away, the closer you got, you could see the face of Christ. I'm like, oh, this is something. Well, a priest and an artist friend of mine happened to come by my studio that day, and they both saw it. They said, oh my gosh, that's the Cloud of Unknowing, which is this book. I didn't know about it, but this book from 14th century monk that said, I'm paraphrasing it, that knowledge will only get you so far to knowing God, but the more that you put God under a cloud of forgetting or knowing, the closer you'll be to God through the heart. Okay? I was like, whoa. And what's interesting and why I tell that story, and I'm ending on this, is because I think what it did is I didn't see that. I didn't know that title. They saw it, and then they named it. So therefore, it became a new gift. Like, we need each other to see in new ways. What are the ways we can name the racism that might be within us, the ways we're not loving our neighbor well, or those in the margins well, or through all manner of disease ourselves, right? And so it's my hope that, and again, I'm not the only one doing this. There's so many other artists doing incredible iconography and work in the country. But I continue to, as kind of a closing out this weekend with you all, I thank you. Continue to enter into this dialogue. What artists, what artwork could you kind of bring before your community to have that dialogue and discussion, to understand each other well, and to have genuine conversations about where you are in your community and during this time. And so I thank you for involving Eddie and I in that, just even for a weekend, and hopefully you continue to be able to do that from afar. But thank you all so much.
I want to thank Kelly and Abby for being here and for giving so much. They have been here since Friday morning, installation, all day yesterday and again this morning. And it has been such a gift. You have been such a gift to us. Normally we would take questions, but we know the 11:15 people want to get to the 11:15. I think if you've already done church, or are okay being a little late to 11:15, if you will just stay with us a little bit and come on up and have maybe a little conversation with Kelly. But we do want to let folks get to the service or to hear from Mother Lindsay and to enjoy the 11:15 Eucharist. So.